Welcome to my channel, SynTech Gaming. If you find this video helpful, help me out by liking the video, dropping a comment below, subscribing to my channel, or follow me where I do my video game streaming at facebook.com/SynTech Gaming. In this video, we're going to be reviewing the Astro C40 TR controller. I've had the controller for a couple weeks now in order to bring you the most in-depth and accurate review possible on this controller. I've got this review video set up where we're going to be looking over the basics of the controller, what you get in the box, and what's available as far as switches and controls on the controller. And then we will step into the more detailed aspects of this controller, looking at the software, looking what all you can customize, and all the functions and capabilities of this controller. Let me start off by saying that this video is not sponsored. I purchased this controller with my own money. If anyone from Astro is watching this and they would like to change that, feel free. I did see that new mix amp that was just produced by Astro. I would love to have the PS4 version of it. Wink, wink. Okay, so let's start off by looking at the basics on this controller. It is a PS4 PC controller. It is an official licensed Sony product. When you open the box, you are then left with a very nice carrying case. The zipper is a little hard to get around the corners of the case. I feel like I have to be a little careful with it in order to not break the zipper. It has not broken, but a little tough to pull around. That may just be my case. The controller is $200. Which is, I believe, the most expensive Elite controller on the market. Looking at this controller, when you first pick it up, the first thing you're going to realize is that this controller is heavy. It weighs more than the DualShock 4 controller, and it's pretty similar to the weight of the Xbox One Elite controller, if you've ever held that. The other thing that you will realize is the size of this controller. This controller has almost an extra ½ inch in width on it compared to a DualShock 4 controller. It's very comfortable in my hands. I do have larger hands. When I go to the store and buy gloves, I typically get large or extra large gloves. If you buy medium gloves, you may or may not find this controller comfortable. If you buy small gloves, you probably will not find this controller comfortable. Now, that's just my personal opinion. You may end up with different results. Inside the case, you will find your tool for swapping the modules around and removing the faceplate. You will find your additional analog caps, and you will find your USB wireless transmitter. Analog caps all together, you have 2 short concave and 1 tall concave. You then have 2 short domed and 1 long domed analog caps. That is in total. I personally have found that I like a short concave for my running and motion, and a tall domed for my aiming, and those just pop right onto the controller. The rest of them go right back into the case. Now, the case has extra spots for the D-pad cover and the optional accessory of the round D-pad cover. Now, in the video that Astro released for this controller, it showed that round D-pad cover, so some users were surprised when their controller did not come with it. I don't play fighting games, so this did not bother me personally. The wire that comes with this controller is just over 6 feet long. Whoever designed this, I have to give them a thumbs up. They plug on the controller to have a outside diameter that fits the shape of the cord. The reason why this is done is so that when you have this controller plugged in and playing in wired mode, The pressure from you moving around is then applied to this part of the cord where it is designed to be, and you're not worried about the pressure being on the actual plug. If you consistently play with your DualShock 4 in a wired mode, you're probably aware that that plug wears out very quickly because all the stress is right there on the actual plug. So you don't have to worry about that with this Astro controller. Looking at the options on this controller, you do have a switch on the top for wired or wireless mode. You have a switch on the top for Profile 1 or Profile 2. This allows you to have your buttons or sensitivities for your triggers or analog sticks programmed to a certain profile for 1 and a certain profile for 2, allowing you to switch immediately between two setups on your controller. On the bottom of the controller, you will find the 2 programmable extra buttons on this controller. I personally like this setup with the 2 buttons versus the 4. When I'm gripping this controller, my ring finger and pinky finger immediately hold the controller. My middle fingers lay precisely on the extra trigger buttons, and then my first fingers are firmly on the triggers. It feels extremely natural. There's no additional strain on my hand as far as holding this controller and the grip on it. In my personal opinion, this controller is extremely comfortable. I've had no accidental button presses of the rear buttons. This is a little bit of a controversial topic though, personal preference on whether or not you have to have the 4 buttons or 2 buttons is enough. I personally think that 2 buttons is plenty. You have your swappable trigger stops. There's a programming button on the bottom of the controller, which allows you to map the buttons on this controller by using that button, which means you do not have to have a computer to change what you have the under buttons or any of the buttons on the face programmed to. I think that's a great idea, as if you decide you want to do something else with these under buttons while you're in a tournament setting, you can simply use the program button and switch it. Underneath that, there is a very tiny reset button that requires a paperclip or similar small object to operate. The face of the controller, you're set up with all of the standard PlayStation buttons, share and options, touchpad, everything's there. And then you also have your 3.5mm headset jack. This does have a built-in Astro mix amp, so when you use your headset on this controller compared to a normal DualShock 4 controller, your headset is going to sound better. The faceplate does come off of this controller, which is a really cool feature. You can set this controller up as a PlayStation style or Xbox style controller. Very smart design choice here. The screws on the faceplate have tiny C-clips on them, which keep them from falling out. So you don't have to worry about losing your screws when you have your faceplate removed. The analog modules and D-pad module come out of the controller. The analog and D-pad module have a red line on them, as well as the controller has the red lines inside of the slots that they go in. You then match up the red line to the red line and it slides into place. There are also tiny magnets that attach to the screws on the module there. So when you have it lined up in place, you will feel that it kind of sticks in there a little bit with the magnet. You can set this controller up Xbox style. You can even pull both these modules out and put both analog sticks on the left side if you wanted to. Not sure why you would do that, but you can. The connectors inside the controller are on springs, so they press down when you have the faceplate attached, which ensures a great connection. Some users are surprised that the Astro controller uses the wireless adapter. The wireless adapter and wireless setup for this controller operates on a 2.4 gigahertz wireless frequency, which is the same as a router in a home wireless network. The DualShock 4 controller uses Bluetooth, which is very limited on speeds and the amount of data that it can carry. So you will find that this controller operating on this 2.4 wireless network frequency can carry more data, faster, and more reliable connection than a Bluetooth connection. So before we get into the software, there are a few things that the regular DualShock controller can do that the Astro controller can't do. The first two things is the controller cannot turn on your PlayStation. You cannot hit the PlayStation button and turn on your console. When your console is on and you push the PlayStation button and you get that little notification in the top left, there is no battery level indication. Now, both of those things could be updated and changed in a future firmware. The other thing that this controller is not capable of that your PS4 controller can do is the motion keyboard. So I don't know how many of you, when you're typing in things with this controller, you have the option where you move the controller up, down, left, right in order to select the key that you want, and then X to select it. This controller cannot do that. Okay, so getting into the software and really what this controller is capable of. When you have this controller plugged into your PC, first off, the software itself can be updated. The controller firmware can be updated, and you can also update the firmware on the USB wireless adapter when you plug that into your computer as well. So as long as there's not something physically wrong with this controller, all of the functions of this controller can be updated via firmware updates. When you start using the software, you are presented with your Profile 1 and Profile 2 options. Depending on which option you have selected, will allow you to view that profile and edit it. Let's start at the top of this software and work our way down. At first, we come into the button mapping. All of the buttons on this controller can be changed and mapped. So if I wanted X to be triangle, I can simply select it there. It's very simple and easy to do. The one thing that you can't do currently is map a button to L2 or R2. Which we found that kind of strange because even in the instructions it says that you can map the under buttons to L2 and R2. A couple other things that I want to point out while we're in the button mapping section. You cannot map any of the buttons on this controller to a keyboard key or a mouse click. A lot of people have asked me, hey, can I make the under buttons mouse 1 and mouse 2, or the face buttons my WSAD keys? No, you cannot program keyboard or mouse buttons to this controller. There are also no macro functions on this controller, so you cannot tell this controller that when I hit X, I want it to actually tell the game that I hit square, triangle, circle. You cannot hit left on the D-pad and tell it to do some unique input of buttons. Looking at our next option down is our analog sticks. I have purposely programmed my analog sticks to have a little bit of stick drift, which you can see by the orange input and the dot being moved without the button being pressed. Now, Astro has put in a way that you can push and hold the program button and enter programming mode, and then push and hold the programming button again without pushing any other buttons. And that resets and recenters your analog sticks. So whenever you remove the faceplate and swap these analog modules around, you may find that you have some stick drift, and you may find that you need to come in and recenter those analog sticks in order to fix any stick drift that you have. So you can adjust the sensitivity on your analog sticks and triggers. You can simply come in and pull these sliders up, down, however you want to do it, in order to customize these however you want. The other nice thing is if you're trying to do very specific and you want to do 1% at a time, you can click on the numbers down here and adjust those by typing in what you want them to be, which allows you very precise control instead of just sliding it up and down. I was a little surprised to see that there's no customization for the dead zone on these controllers. However, you will see that the dead zone is very minimal on this controller. It is smaller than the DualShock controller. The other thing that I want to point out while we're talking about the analog sticks is the analog stick tension. It is easier to press and move the analog sticks on the C40 controller than it is on the DualShock controller. Now, I like this because it feels smoother to me with the less stick tension. It allows me to be able to do the finer movements easier. It does take a little bit of getting used to though. Our next tab down is our trigger stops. Now, there's a couple things that I have issues with the trigger stops. The first one being when you have the trigger stops enabled and you pull your trigger, it means that the trigger does not travel the full distance. So you can see here on my left trigger, I have the full pull, the trigger stop is not enabled. On my right trigger, I have the trigger stop enabled and it stops right at 40%. Well, the interesting thing about that is some games do not recognize a 40% input as a trigger pull. So if you put your trigger stops on and all of a sudden you pull your triggers and it's not doing anything in the game, you actually need to plug your controller up to the computer and program it in the software to ensure that you are hitting 100% trigger pull by the time it is stopping against the trigger stop. Now that's not difficult to do, but I find it a little strange that you can't just flip the trigger stops on and they just work. The other issue that I run into is that with both trigger stops enabled, my right trigger goes to about 40%, my left trigger goes to about 60%. I think this could have been a little bit better designed. This has no negative impact on the controller functioning as long as I have set them to hit 100% by the time they hit the trigger stop. It just kind of bugs me personally that there's as much as a 20% difference in the trigger stops. But once again, there's no negative impact on the controller and its functionality. Moving down to the audio tab, you'll remember earlier I said that this thing, when you use your headset on this controller, it's going to sound better. This is because of the built-in mix amp. You can customize the EQ settings on this controller so that you can hear the sounds that you want to in the game better. When you use your headset on this controller, it's going to sound better. You can also customize the microphone level for your headset. You can also customize the side tone level, which is how loud you hear yourself through your headset. And then there is also a C40 speaker volume adjustment. Some games utilize that speaker volume and you can turn that all the way off so you don't have to hear that if you don't want to. The next tab down, we have our rumble intensity levels. You cannot remove the rumble motors in this controller. I know there are some other controllers out there that allow you to do that. This controller will allow you to adjust the intensity of those rumble motors all the way down to 0% if you want to turn them off entirely. You then can control the LED brightness on the controller down to 20%. You can't turn the LED off because the LED does tell you if your battery is going to die on your controller, as well as whether or not your controller is currently connected. All in all, my review on this controller, I give this controller an 8 out of 10. I would have loved to have seen the trigger stops function a little bit better with a hard stop around 40 to 50%, so that you could customize those a little bit more clearly, and not have that up to 20% difference between the triggers. I also think that when you enable the trigger stops, that you shouldn't have to potentially program the triggers to make them work in a game. I'm not sure exactly how they would have accomplished that, but I do think it is possible. The controller is $200, which is pretty pricey. We are nearing the end of the PS4 life cycle. So in my best guess, we've got about a year and a half left until the PS5 comes out, and we don't know for sure if this controller is going to work on the PS5. So a $200 investment on a controller is pretty expensive this late in the life cycle of the console. However, I will say that if you're going out to buy a $120 plus controller for your PlayStation, and you don't absolutely have to have the 4 buttons on the bottom, I think you would be better off to spend the additional money and get this controller. You have a better program for programming, you have better support through Astro, and the controller feels amazing in the hands. I've had no issue with my hands or forearms feeling uncomfortable while playing with this controller. I hope this video has helped you out. If it has, help me out by hitting the subscribe button on this channel and dropping a comment below to let me know what you thought about the video. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.